ABRF's Executive Director. Thank you for joining in another version of this very popular series. We have a terrific presentation planned for you today, but before we get to that, I'm just going to make a couple of ABRF housekeeping announcements and reminders. First off, if you have questions for today's presenter, please put those in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself in chat based on where you're connecting from, your name, your institution. And if you have ideas for future ABRF programs in this series or otherwise, please send those along to us. You can see the email address here on the screen. A couple of, again, just housekeeping or other reminders for ABRF. Whoops. I hope all of you have seen ABRF's updated strategy, which is built on these 4 pillars around communicating the value of shared research resources, creating a vibrant and collaborative community, and this type of program is a great example of that, along with advancing professional development, whether it's through online activities, credentialing, or elaborating on career pathways in shared research resources, and then ultimately investigating establishing standards of excellence. That might be best practices for facilities or even accreditation. So that's where we'll be going over the next 3 years. Here's a snapshot of some of the objectives that are tied to those 4 goals. And ABRF has established task forces that are going to guide the implementation of each of these goals. So if you're an active ABRF member, you may be reached out to or tapped on the shoulder to participate and contribute. And please consider that to help advance the activities that ABRF is pursuing. Some other programs that we have on the calendar for this month, tomorrow, in fact, the DEIB Council hosts its next virtual training program on speaking up, including a practice session on how to advocate for workplace accommodations. And then next week, we have our regular monthly program on virtual peer mentoring conversations, where you set the agenda. If there's a topic or a concern that you have in your career development, please bring that to the discussion and we'll explore that together. Hopefully, many of you know that ABRF chapter meetings are underway following the terrific successful meeting for the CSER, the Southeastern chapter, just a couple of weeks ago. Next up is MAD-SCI, the Mid-Atlantic chapter in September in Richmond. And then you can see the rest of the calendar here on the screen. You can find all the chapter meeting information on the ABRF website. We'll just go over a couple of the highlights for each of the chapter meetings. You can see MAD-SCI, as I mentioned, September 15 to 17 in Richmond, followed by our newest chapter, the South Central Core Collective. We'll be meeting in Dallas this year at the end of September. Our West Coast chapter moves up the coast to Seattle, hosted at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center in October. Our Northeastern chapter will be meeting in New Haven, connected with Yale University, also in October. And then finally, our Midwest chapter will be at the University of Wisconsin in Madison near the end of the month of October. And they'll continue with their very popular Halloween costume contest, so you can get an early start on your Halloween plans at the Midwest meeting. Whether you were able to join us at the ABRF annual meeting this year in Las Vegas or didn't happen to be with us, you can access recordings, slide presentations, and summaries of many of the key sessions at this link here on the website. And then I hope you're participating in the core community, which is an online platform for you to reach all of your ABRF peers or over 100 subgroups in different specialty areas, including light microscopy. Each of the research groups has a community where you can engage, share resources, and post questions to your colleagues to get very quick answers and exchange information. All right, with that, I will stop that and turn it over to Rich Cole, who will introduce today's speaker. Rich?
All right, thanks, Ken. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Doug, who's going to speak on AI and ethics in imaging. And just a couple of notes. One is that Doug's portion of this webinar is going to be recorded. So we're going to hold all the questions basically till after he is done, because from then on, we will not be recording. So that allows people to be as open and honest as they feel free. So there will be no recording of the questions or discussion that come after Doug's part. Also, just so that you know, that this series will take a break for August, And then we will come back in September with some image processing kind of 101 type of things. And we'll do that. And then there'll be some data management and other different topics that will go until the actual annual meeting next year. So look forward to those. And the last thing I have to say as a disclaimer is that nothing that is said here is supported by ABRF or by the New York State Department of Health or by any other entity. It's only our own perspective. So having said that, and that's recorded, I'm going to turn it over to Doug now.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Ken. All right. Well, thank you all for inviting me and let's get started here. So we're gonna frame this issue a little bit here by looking at what some folks have said. You know, the scientific enterprise is built on a foundation of trust. But this is appropriate because the Tour de France is happening right now. It says, you know, misconduct is like doping in sport. It's an unfair advantage over our competitors. And if you're not familiar with the man in the bike helmet on the left, that's Lance Armstrong, supposedly a 7-time winner of the Tour de France until it came out that he had cheated along the way. So I wanted to look up and see how bad the problem was. And looking back historically, the Journal of Cell Biology has had a screening program for their images, and about 1% of their accepted papers they discovered had manipulated images that affected the conclusions. And about 25% of them, sometimes 50% in a given issue, according to Michael Rossner, had some sort of manipulation that violated their fairly explicit guidelines. There's a well-known paper by Elizabeth Bick that looked at over 20,000 papers, mostly looking at gel bands, and found about 4% of those papers had problematic figures. I went through the case studies on the Office of Research Integrity website and checked them yesterday, actually. Out of the 31 cases, a little over 75% of them mentioned image manipulation or figure misuse. And I was actually a little surprised because the last time I looked there was a faculty member from my own institution whose name was on there, and I don't know why his name is no longer there, but it happens to everywhere. Retraction Watch has a database, and it's been a little while since I did this query, but they had about 14% of the publications in their database due to retractions related to image issues. And if you've been following the news, there's been a roiling of the concerns around Alzheimer's research because not just this particular person, Dr. Maslia, but others have questioned some of the research around the whole neurofibrillary plaques and tangles and things like that. And in this science article, they said this pattern of anomalous data, and we're talking about decades worth of publications, creates a credible concern for research misconduct and calls into question a large body of scientific work. And, you know, just this one person's publications are relied on by many other people as well. So it's becoming, it looks poor for science in that regard. And we have these issues, and we have people who are intentionally committing fraud. Somebody is, even if not necessarily all the people on a publication are. And there are also people who take things a little bit too far. And based on my experience in the trenches, it's really often a combination of exuberance, you know, I want to do this, and the fact that they really don't know what they're doing. Now, if you look at the ORI definition of misconduct, we've all probably had this pounded into our heads. We have the whole fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. And those are very real. The first two are probably the most common, but there is some plagiarism, and I'll show you some of that. And when I was at the meeting in Boston a few years ago, I mentioned this, that research misconduct does not include honest error. This is a caveat that comes with this definition. And honest error is kind of hard to prove, but differences of opinion. So my thought is if you tell people exactly what you did, then if they disagree with your protocol, then it becomes a matter of opinion, not misconduct. And there was a gentleman from the Office of Research Integrity there, and when I said that in the discussion time, he was sitting there nodding his head. So I think I was on to something. These pictures of blots were given to me by John Kruger, who used to do a lot of the image investigation work with ORI. He's now retired. But you can see that people were creative. They flipped things around. They reused gel bands. But it's not just gel bands. It's really anything that's a bitmap can be manipulated. So you have this example here. What I know about genetics could fit on the back of my business card with room to spare. But as John notes, what exactly is happening right here where you have the data from this larger figure compared to this smaller figure? You can see they've done some manipulation there. And plagiarism can happen. This was an example of someone who began to notice that there were a figure was lifted and modified such that pieces of it were used to create a new figure. So if you look at these colored boxes between the original figure and the later figure, you can see that these things are basically identical. And this very excellent paper from quite a long time ago now from Dr. Rossner and Dr. Yamada that was in the Journal of Cell Biology just showed some examples of what they'd seen. So these were actually figures that they created so that they could show them rather than use other people's work. So they removed bands, they added bands, they reused things and called them different controls. People used the rubber stamp tool to try and get rid of things that were inconvenient. They combined images from two different pieces and pasted them together, and selectively enhanced certain parts of the image. So this next section is just a little bit of my own personal opinions on how people get to where they've made some bad choices. I was doing some reading and I came across this article about the Challenger disaster. This is the space shuttle. And if you remember anything about the disaster, what ended up happening is that gas leaked from the O-rings in the segments of the solid rocket boosters and caused the whole thing to explode. But what was happening is each time NASA did a launch, with engineering, you have specs. This thing can be used within these parameters. It can't be too hot, can't be too cold. Well, the specs on the solid rocket boosters said that there was a certain temperature that they shouldn't be used at. And over the years, NASA had pushed down that temperature year by year to the point where when the Challenger launch happened, it was very cold in Florida. I don't know if it was at freezing or was very close to freezing. And the different contraction that happened in the materials as they were connected together allowed the leak to happen and this awful accident to occur. So it's one of those things where we push the boundaries, push the boundaries, and push the boundaries, and then suddenly it no longer feels like it's wrong. And then I read another article by a man named Caleb Christensen from Harvard Business Review, and he was talking about holding on to your principles. And this quote really struck me. And then as you read later on in the article, he was actually a classmate of Jeffrey Skilling, who was the CEO of Enron. And Enron is a classic example of insider trading where they said, we're doing great. And yet the executives of the company were rapidly selling their stock because they knew it was doing poorly. And this isn't necessarily a hypothetical example to me because my neighbor rode that stock into the ground. Who's elderly man, and he thought he'd bought a good one, and it it took away a significant chunk of money out of his pocket. So why do we take images? Well, John Russ says that we expect to see things when we look at different things, and maybe we see what we want to see, or we fail to recognize things that are unfamiliar. We misjudge things that we don't have an appropriate set of clues for, and we believe that we've seen things. This is why um, optical illusions work. You know, we think we understand what we're seeing, but actually our eye is easily fooled. And our memory's unreliable. The amount of data that we can capture now from microscopes is incredible. And we're not back in the days of the early microscopy where people had the time to do actual hand drawings. Read an article in Microscopy Today about this figure from Robert Hooke. Apparently, even though he had his own microscope, he used something more like a Leeuwenhoek microscope to look at the individual parts of the flea to get enough detail to create this figure. So he was using two different types of microscopes. But we document our findings. That's what we do, and we share them with others. And the only way to do that is to take pictures. So what's under the hood with a microscope? Well, this is sort of the underlying premise of the guidelines that I came up with, is that instead of it being a picture, we actually have data. We have bitmaps. We have maps of intensity values. And even more complicated image data is still arrays of numbers, sometimes very complex numbers. And any image processing step that we can do, any of them are going to change those numbers. And if you've never seen something like this, I learned this from a friend. Here's an image of from a super resolution microscope, and let's just take this one channel here and zoom in on this one area a little bit. And now we're going to turn it into numbers. So this was originally 16-bit data, but I made it 8-bit. And the bigger numbers are the brighter pixels. And to help you see that, I did a bit of an overlay. So really, we're working with numbers. And I jokingly have said many times that there isn't an accountant on the planet that would apply an unknown function to a spreadsheet and say, oh, those numbers look better. But yet we find users who would happily apply filters and other tools to the images and say that they look better. So here are the guidelines. If you've read the paper, you're probably familiar with them. What my goal was to explain the why. And the assumption was that people were intentionally trying to be truthful. They weren't trying to deceive others, that hopefully they were doing good science, and that they were not being biased in their image acquisitions. So, like I said before, images are data, and they can be compromised by processing. They're subject to the limitations of our physics and our instrument design, and it may seem like they represent what's there, but we also have to understand the limitations of the particular instrument. And sometimes even the limitations of our samples. So many of you know this, that the human eye is not sensitive to all wavelengths evenly. If we're using color cameras, they use these Bayer masks, which creates some interesting issues. Even cameras, this is getting to be an older camera. This is a original Hamamatsu, I think this is an Orca. Doesn't have sensitivity equal in every wavelength. We have complicated multi-lens objectives. We have things that need to be properly scaled. we have the complications of filters, and probably the most interesting and difficult part of dealing with being in a core facility, we have these folks, our regular users, some of whom are amazing and you love and you cheer them on, and others of whom you cringe when they show up because they try and put live samples on the microscope without doing their biosafety paperwork. So many of you are aware that the NSF and NIH have required data management plans now, and working with data is a really big problem. And for those of us that have been around a while, we've dealt with incompatible file formats, with problems with obsolete storage materials, and we've started using Omero at the University of Arizona, although I will admit it's hard to get people to get on board with that. But Omero is really good for data management, and it's particularly good with preserving the acquisition metadata, because the information can be uploaded in original file formats. And why do we want to manage data? Well, you're your most likely future collaborator. And the problem is that past you does not respond to emails from future yous. So you need to leave some clues. And you want to store it with proper annotations and metadata. Otherwise, it's not very useful to yourself or to anyone else. And, you're going to have data loss, so you do need to do backups. And I really like this quote that the report is the advertisement for the research. The data is the actual research. So number two, the original data is the standard for which the final image can be compared. If you are working on images and you're processing them, it's always good at some point to start with the original image and the final image, put them side by side and say, are they an accurate representation of what we started with? And keeping a copy of the original image is also a protection against accusation of misconduct. There's many times when people just can't produce the original data. Well, sometimes that's very much true. They can't. But other times it's because they don't want to. And it's good to keep it in the original format, even though sometimes that can be difficult to work with. And it's also a way where you can protect yourself from a processing mistake. That way you have the original data, you can just go back to square one and start all over again. So this is one of the few guidelines where I'm very emphatic that you should always, always, always work on a copy of the original image. And simple adjustments, things that we used to do in the darkroom are usually considered acceptable. Reasonable adjustments of levels and gammas. Now, depending on which field you're in the electron microscopy field, gamma is considered a non-reportable function. In the light microscopy field, it's considered something that should be reported. And one way you can do that, you can monitor that, is to look at images and look at their histogram, because it should be a fairly continuous histogram. If it's got gaps or spikes, or it's very shifted in one direction and there's no data in part of it, very possibly not original data. And it's important to keep an audit trail of what you've done. Unfortunately, with a lot of software, it's very difficult to get anything like an audit trail still. So it's very likely going to come down to people keeping track of it manually, or on, in Notepad or something. I did this step, I did that step, so that you know what was done. So a histogram stretch, we have this image that, gosh, it could be just a little bit brighter, and you can see that the data doesn't quite go all the way out to the full extent. So let's do the histogram stretch. Now we've brought the brightest pixels out to 255 on the 8-bit scale. A little bit more interesting image to look at. The histogram now has added spaces in it. That's what a histogram stretch does. It's done routinely. It doesn't change the overall shape of the histogram to a great extent, and it's considered a function that doesn't need to be reported. The reason gamma is an issue is because it's a nonlinear function. So if you change the gamma, you can see that going to a higher gamma shifts the intensity of a pixel less than going to a lower gamma. So it's not evil. Part of the reason we use gamma is because people often don't see well in the darker shades of gray or the brighter shades of gray. Things get lost in there. So by shifting the gamma, you can actually take the information that you want people to see and move it into the part of the sensitivity of the eye that works better for the common viewer. And cropping an image is usually acceptable, but you have to sort of take a moment and examine yourself and say, why am I cropping? Am I trying to avoid inconvenient data, or is it simply a compositional information? Why am I making this crop? So if I told you that I'd recently been snorkeling down in Mexico and I saw this, you might be impressed, but if you knew it was in this context, you might realize, okay, he's trying to pull my leg. Not to mention the fact that this is a Taiwanese whale shark, and I wouldn't have seen it in Mexico. And when you're going to compare images to one another, you want to do this under identical conditions, and any post-processing should be identical. The thing that I typically find is that students and grad students and sometimes staff are the ones that are operating the microscopes. I see very little faculty microscope use. So it becomes you have acquirers who've captured the image and you have another set of people who are the interpreters of the image. And if they don't know that the images have been adjusted in different ways, they could make some misunderstandings about what's happening. Processing should be identical, especially if you're going to put figures together. And if there's a good reason for why the images were processed differently, it should probably be explained. Even if the journal doesn't publish your explanation, again, this is part of the differences of scientific opinion do not constitute misconduct. You can always go, well, I told the journal, and they decided not to include that information. If you're going to do things like white level balancing or background subtraction because uneven illumination happens, you should probably acknowledge that in the methods section as well. And I'm not a big fan of Photoshop's auto levels because they tend to clip things on the histogram. If you're doing things that are specific to one area and maybe not to another, those are starting to be questionable. We used to do a lot of dodging and burning in the darkroom when I was in the electron microscopy world for certain kinds of samples because we were trying to get something and make it contrasty enough to be seen. Again, honesty is the best policy if you're going to do selective enhancement, and it should be upfront. It might be better to do something like an inset box so that people understand that you have raw data or lightly processed data, and the inset box is now over processed, more processed, however you want to say that. Filters are wonderful. They have some uses, but for the most part, they are problematic. I like this image of this is from the scanning tunneling microscope. These are apparently the kanji characters for the word atom. But what makes this appear more real to me is I can see the clouds, the electron clouds of the substrate, in addition to the atoms that have been dragged to create the kanji characters. So it makes it look more real to me. If for some reason you had smoothed out the background, that would look like CGI. So we have to think about why people might read our publication. It may be that they're really interested in the substrate that we culture our cells on, or you're interested in the mitochondria, but they're really kind of fascinated by what's happening in the nuclei. So if we're over processing the unimportant things, we may actually have misled those who are reading our research. And copying and pasting to clean things up, or clone stamping and those kind of things, those are some of the fastest ways to get yourself in trouble with journals, because they can find those pretty easily. Um, there's a lot of things that are still a little hard for image sleuths to find, but this is not one of them. So don't go doing this. Recently, I looked at a situation where someone was trying to make a gel band darker, and they literally just put a black box on top of the band and tried to hide it from the edges. Like, really? And here's an example. We do this half-day workshop for members of our community here at the University of Arizona. Will be doing it next month. And Dr. Boswell, who's now retired, made this figure for the first year we did it back in 2007. And he wanted to show people that he had added or taken away a gel band. And I just clicked the mouse, so a gel band just disappeared, but you might not have seen it. So let me put a circle around it. And I'm going to click it again, and it will reappear. And now it's gone. Now the question becomes is, which is the original data? And honestly, he doesn't remember anymore. Now this wasn't research data. This was something that he borrowed to modify. But the question becomes is, if somebody left this in your lab, would you know that it was original data or not? So intensity measurements are things that people really want to do, and software makes it easy to do. The problem is that the acquisition of good data that can be appropriately measured for intensity is much, much harder. And most people, especially most of our users, really have no business trying to do this. Jim Pauly's 39 steps, which is only about 3 pages, is what we often give people, because there really is a lot of technical information in there that people using our microscopes have no idea that they would need to control for. And sometimes people go, well, we could do DAB staining. And unfortunately, DAB does not have a completely linear optical profile. If you get into the really heavily stained DAB, it's dark, and it just, the curve flattens out. So it's sort of sigmoidal, and at either end, it's not linear. JPEG is another issue, and JPEG is less of a problem than it was 20 years ago when I first came up with these guidelines, because people were frantic about bandwidth. Now we have lots of bandwidth, but we still need to be careful, because people still are, their phone pictures are JPEG. Why wouldn't we use JPEG? If you're going to share something where you have to email it to someone and it's a very large image, JPEG might be an appropriate way to do it. You want to save it the highest quality factor as possible. Do it once, so that you're not multiply running the JPEG algorithm, because it does degrade the image every time it's saved as JPEG. And you really don't save a whole lot in the way of size. The default setting in Acrobat is JPEG. When I published the Twisted Pixels paper, I sent off about 10 megabytes worth of figures and Word document to the journal, and they sent me back a 1 megabyte PDF. And I laughed and said, oh, I guess they didn't read the paper. and we negotiated and got it up to a 5 megabyte PDF, which had a little bit of compression, but the figures were so much better. And beware if if you find you have a PowerPoint that's too large and you want to use the compression function, be aware that that's also a lossy compression. So here's a figure from a standard fluo cell slide. Do a little bit of histogram stretch to make it brighter. And if we plot them doing a colocalization style scatter plot, one against the other, a TIFF versus a TIFF, these are identical images and they correlate perfectly. And John Kruger suggested this, but if you do a JPEG, and this was a quality factor of 9, which isn't bad, you can see that while they still correlate, there is a little more variability in it. And these gaps, by the way, are the histogram stretch showing up. But it gives you an idea that there's more going on than you realized, and it tends to shift intensities. We spend a lot of time and care in getting high contrast images, and JPEG is trying to smooth things out. So it's really not appropriate for science images. And just to back that up, the Joint Photographic Experts Group points out that there are things that are lost. John Russ says, if you don't know what's important, then don't throw it away ahead of time. And the Journal of Cell Biology says it compromises your data. And when we look at real world objects, we have to remember that everything has a scale. We're familiar with looking at scale bars or creating scale bars, and image resolution now has multiple dimensions, and we all want to keep those scales correctly. And we don't want to lose that scale bar information when we're processing these. And you can usually find that information in the metadata if you have access to the original file. But I sometimes have trouble convincing people that Nyquist sampling is important. So I'll show them this picture. This is from Google Earth. And if you try and count the bench seats in the stadium, you might do okay in these places where they're in straight lines, but here where the curve is, it's really hard to know whether you're getting an accurate number or not, because we simply don't have enough pixels compared to being able to count the cars in the parking lot, which are much larger. So we needed to sample this appropriately to be able to capture the image data for the seats. And I love the fact that since this is the football stadium, we actually have an internal scale bar here on the football field. But that seems a little too abstract for microscopy. So here are the same images taken at 2 different pixel resolutions on the same microscope. I literally just changed the acquisition characteristics. And you can see that in the picture on the right, you can see there are probably three dots. And in the picture on the left at the undersampled setting, maybe there's 2. And even that's sort of wish fulfillment. And you want to be careful when you're changing things to make them bigger or smaller to fit on a page or on a PowerPoint slide, because there will probably be interpolation that's going on. That was more a problem in the early days of getting things from digital into something print related, because printers tend to want 300 dots per inch, and a lot of times images are displayed at 72, and then there was some weird math stuff that went on and people created messes with their images. So my thing is that you just want to do this once, because if you rotate an image or if you upsample an image, you are changing it. So A to B to C is a rotation. It's not badly off, but it's a slightly different image than the original. And the bottom ones are an upsampling. So again, it's close, but it is a little different. So you just don't want to compound those by doing them multiple times. So some practical issues. We have people coming to use our microscopes. We've talked about sampling issues. People like 1024 by 1024, but at a 40x objective, that's probably not enough pixels unless they're zoomed in quite a bit. And Z-stacks and time lapse can also be undersampled. Whoops, let me go previous. And if you've if you've never seen how a time lapse can be undersampled, look on YouTube for videos of helicopters where they have synchronized the frame rate of the camera to the rotational speed of the helicopter blades. It's pretty bizarre to watch helicopters float and the propeller blades or the rotor blades are not moving. Detector saturation, I try and remind people that they can make smaller objects appear larger than they are by taking those transitional pixels around the edges of bright objects and making them bright enough to where thresholding will capture those as well. And anything that's saturated is not going to do math analysis like colocalization correctly. Dim samples, I've got people that want to take pictures 8, 9, 10 seconds, and it captures the light of just about everything. And it is going to be, sometimes it's noisy or sometimes it's just capturing the autofluorescence in the sample on my wide field scopes. We all have users that want to cherry pick the best images, encourage them to be random sampling as much as is reasonable. And again, we talked about image settings. Things go up, things go down. Are they being consistent? They need to be. And then just the whole issues of sample prep, and we'll get back to that in a minute. And then post-processing, changing in file formats can sometimes result in the loss of metadata. Changing the number of pixels or the bit depth, again, loses information. I've shown you several 8-bit images that started as 16 bits. There's a lot. The difference between 65,000 and 256 is pretty substantial, especially when you're trying to threshold things. Lossy compression. And even global and fairly reproducible changes, if enough of them happen in a row and none of them are documented, they can get to the point where they are reducing the quality of the image data. And people want to use the vendor software, but they don't really know how it works, and they can end up causing trouble as well. And if you throw in the possibility that it's statistically underpowered, maybe biased, and who knows what's going on, then it's sometimes frightening what people do with their data once they leave our facilities, and they don't talk to us about it. If you haven't seen these, this is an amazing set of checklists that was put together by an international group that is talking about quality and reproducibility. I encourage you to read this article. It's unfortunate that the citation doesn't list all of the authors because there's about 30 of them, and there's some big names in there. And if any of you are on this call, my hat's off to you. This was a great article. So we've talked about the ways that people manipulate images in things like Photoshop. Let's talk a little bit about AI. So AI is a tool. It's an algorithm. It's not intelligent in the sense that even your kid is intelligent. If you have children or your nieces or nephews. Different types of AI are complex software that uses these learned experience to guess well. And it's just a tool. And when I gave my son a hammer when he turned 13. I told him, you know, this is a tool. You can use it either to hammer a nail or you could use it to bash somebody's head in. It depends on you to know how to use this tool properly. And many of us, if we've been around long enough, remember that we were highly skeptical of that whole deconvolution thing. It's like, how could math make for better images? And it took a while, but now it's pretty much an accepted part of most people's toolkit. And like all new techniques, AI needs to be tested and well understood before it can be used routinely. And in this portion of the talk, I'm using AI to cover pretty much the whole range of different techniques. And you know, if you listen to the news, if you read the product pamphlets from the vendors, and everybody's trying to one up one another, it's amazing, it's versatile, it's simple to use, and they rarely mention its weaknesses. So AI can be consciously or unconsciously biased by the training data, leading it to make incorrect conclusions. It can hallucinate. There's some great stories or great amusing stories of AI making stuff up that isn't true. Um, Legal briefs that were filed in court or for that matter, from the Department of Health and Human Services, a recent report had references that didn't exist. And there's almost always a benefit from having someone that's knowledgeable and human in the loop to evaluate the results. We often don't know how the AI is doing what it's doing. You know, since I referenced deconvolution, in we can find out from most of the companies what algorithm they're using. And if you're a math inclined person, you can follow that rather carefully. With AI, a lot of times we have no idea how it's getting from point A to point B. And is it reproducible? And how would we know if it was? And you know, the same rules and guidelines that apply to image processing about the fact that it's numerical applies to AI. And do we know that AI plays by the same rules? And I'll toss out my apologies to vendors, but I have been in the past 30, 40 years been oversold on products that underperformed. Probably the scariest thing is the generative AI. So if you've used Photoshop, it can be used to fill in missing data. Say you composited a couple of images together and you need some sky to fill in the space a little bit. Photoshop is pretty good at doing that. One caveat about Photoshop is they trained it all on their stock photos. So if you're the kind of person that would be inclined to think about using Photoshop to create some fake data, Photoshop has never looked at microscope images other than perhaps some histology images that I've found in their stock photos. And so Photoshop and Adobe have used their own data to teach the AI, but one of the issues that's playing itself out in the courts and the court of public opinion is whether AI has borrowed other people's copyrighted information to train itself. There are great ways to use this as a tool, but there's a illustration in one of the major science magazines sometime in the last year that was, without getting graphic, a gross overestimation of the reproductive organs of a rat, and nobody caught it until it was published. So it does. The good thing is while it appears to be able to create images like real world images and real world videos. In fact, my son sent me a YouTube link this morning. It's how to teach mom how to recognize AI generated videos. So we're getting to the point where AI will be able to fool most people. The good news is in the microscopy, we don't think that they can yet have the capability of putting things in the proprietary file formats. So we'll know If there's proprietary data, that they probably started out with original data. And they've used generative AI to create data for training sets. And in some cases, they used it just to see if people could tell if it was created or not. So it's going to be an issue, and we need to be aware of it. I have no idea how we'll be able to stop it. The thing about ChatGPT and some of the large language models is I have this mental idea that there's maybe a user out there that will go, hey, ChatGPT, I don't have time to talk to Doug. I want to get a sample prep protocol for my sample. And rather than doing a literature search or reading the methods section, or they're discovering that the methods section doesn't tell them much useful, they just ask GPT, and they get something that maybe is useful. But we all know that sample preps that work for C. elegans or plants or bacteria or fish or cell cultures or mammalian tissues or even EM are all very different from one another. So this is where having an expert, hopefully you all and myself, can help the user avoid a big problem. So this is not a particularly useful resource yet. And it can be useful. Some of the vendors have started to come out with AI tools to assist people in correctly adjusting the controls on our instruments. Do I wish that they knew how to do this themselves? Yes, but many of them don't pay attention to their training. They start fiddling with things. They don't know what they're doing. And they hope to get better data. And you walk in and people have got the laser power set on, oh my gosh. But this seems like a possible useful application of AI for some users at any rate. And segmentation. I've seen some amazing things that people can do with segmentation with trained data, using trained data. Selecting DAPI stain nuclei just using standard thresholding is pretty easy. But other types can be very difficult to segment. And there are tools. One of them is called MicroSam that actually was based, I think it's from research from Meta, that was initially started using on real world images so that you could segment out people or whatever. And now it's being trained to do better at segmenting microscopy data. And even just standard thresholding is going to make some mistakes. AI is going to make some mistakes. As long as they are fairly consistent, reproducible mistakes, it still might be better than assigning the task to an undergraduate. And I've seen some published articles about them using AI to stain unstained paraffin sections for routine histologic stains like H&Es and PAS. And I spent a lot of time in the pathology department early in my career. And I know that this patient is on the table. We need to get a diagnosis so that we can go on to treating it, is critical. So they need to make it quickly. And the good news is, though, is that since this is related to medical treatment, it's going to have to be thoroughly tested and approved by the FDA. But some of what they've done is pretty cool. And again, we want to go trust but verify. There's a human in the loop looking at this and making sure that it works. And we're testing. Are you using someone else's data to train the AI? Well, you might not get the answer that you need. And this could be because there's bias within the data, or that, totally different cell types is really a poor match for your data. And image analysis can do some amazing things, but if we don't know how the AI is working, how do we know, or what it's doing? How do we know if it's correct? And there is a movement within the AI community for explainable AI, which it tells the user how the decision was made. A number of years ago, I worked with a lab and we were using the Definian software, which has now gone out of business, but they use heuristic learning where you paint on certain cell types and say, look for these things. And we ran a test, we got some numbers, and then they took that same sample back to their lab and manually did the analysis to confirm that the Definian software had given them good results. Then they did the whole study. And I would encourage people to think about that. Nobody wants to, in a sense, waste time, but nobody wants to get bad data either. There's been a talk about using AI denoising, and it's definitely cool, but it's not entirely reproducible. So I would not consider denoised images to be quantitative, but it might be useful for improving contrast so that you could do segmentation. And we do have to be aware that until we learn more about AI, there's the possibility of it making stuff up. And again, we're back to that human in the loop. So to wrap things up, let's see what others have said. This is from that What's in a Picture article from Dr. Rossner and Dr. Yamada. And again, we want to look at our original data and our process data and say, hey, does this still accurately represent what we started out with? And again, they can't sort of represent the data. They actually have to be the data. So we're not looking at close resemblance. They actually have to be the data. And this I saw last week. So, there's this big thing coming from the current administration about, quote, gold standard science. And whatever you think of the current administration, you have to admit that as scientists, we have done a lot of work to shoot ourselves in the foot by allowing this kind of misconduct to go on. And we need to make sure that we are submitting and doing good science, and we need to encourage and advocate for this happening in our cores and our labs as well. And this is probably obvious to us, but people look at those pictures like in the Nikon Small World contest or the Olympus contests. Pretty much everybody's got a contest and they go, oh yeah, that's great. How come their images are so beautiful? And actually, the problem is that most people don't appreciate how much sample preparation is the difference between crappy images and good ones. And very rarely does high quality image data need much in the way of post-processing. So if we're having to do a lot of post-processing, then maybe we need to wonder if we have good data to begin with. Some quick acknowledgements. These are the people that provide funding for me, particularly the Southwest Environmental Health Sciences Center. I've been part of that for over 30 years now. We do that workshop that I mentioned, and these are the folks who have gone before. My son's the last one on that list, and he got a chance to teach a few of the workshops before he graduated and went out to work in industry. And just to acknowledge my supervisor who lets me do this kind of work. And I am happy to take any questions. And I'm going to stop sharing and let you guys chime in.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording at this point because that's what I had promised. So if I hit this button,